Welcome. First of all, welcome. This is Unsolicited Perspective. I'm your host, Bruce Anthony, here to lead the conversation in important events and topics that are shaping today's society. Join the conversation by following us wherever you get your audio podcasts. Subscribe to our YouTube channel to watch our video podcasts. Rate, review, like, comment, share. Share with your friends, share with your family. Hell, even share with your enemies. On today's episode, I'll be interviewing Dr. Michael Sierra-Arévalo. He's a professor at the University of Texas, Austin. Also an author, he wrote The Danger Imperative, Violence, Death, and the Soul of Policing. We're going to be talking about his life, his work, and his book. But that's enough for the intro. Let's get to the interview. So like I said at the top, I'm here with Dr. Michael Sierra-Arévalo. He's an author of The Danger Imperative, Violence, Death, and the Soul of Policing, assistant professor in the Department of Sociology, and an associate director of the Liberal Arts Honors Program at the University of Texas at Austin. He has a PhD in sociology from Yale University, and he has a BA in sociology and psychology from the University of Texas at Austin. Dr. Michael, thank you for joining me on today's episode. It's my pleasure to have you on here.
Oh, pleasure's all mine. Thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely. So I always start with every interview. How did it all begin? Can you tell me a little bit about your background?
So I was born in I'm just kidding. Do we want to talk about sort of like my family background or just sort of how the project started? Because they're interrelated, it turns out.
So let's start with the family background.
Yeah,
and then
for sure.
The next question after that will be, were there any influences from your background that led you into your field of study?
Yeah, for sure. So this is something I've been reflecting on a little bit recently. So it turns out that sort of by happenstance, my family is a policing family, just not in the US. So my grandfather was an officer in the Colombian National Police, which is a branch of the military in Colombia. Unlike the U.S., we have a civilianized police force here. And my mom served in the U.S. military. She served in the Army, which is why I wound up in Texas originally. She was stationed at the BAMC Medical Center at Fort Sam Houston after I was born in Binghamton, New York. And even my uncle served in the Army in Colombia. And so it turns out you fast forward 25 years or so, and that was something that I connected with officers about when I was in the car with them. In the interim, though, I went to graduate school, and my initial project was going to be about gangs. I was really interested in studying different ethnicities of gangs, Black gangs, Latino gangs, potentially Asian gangs or white gangs. And I was really interested in ideas of culture. Do these groups think about things like honor and family and these different values differently? And that was deeply influenced by some of my mom's work when she was getting her PhD while she was raising me and my sister in high school. While I was in high school.
Right.
And so she was looking at caregivers of Alzheimer's patients. And for a lot of her work is around how it turns out if you just change the language from English to Spanish, the definition and what the words mean change a lot. And so culture mattered to me a lot. Even growing up, I had a sense of the values, the assumptions that we bring to the world fundamentally shape how we see things. And so I get to grad school. I immediately get attached to a violence reduction project called Project Longevity in New Haven, which is all about reducing shootings and violence at the street level. And that's where I meet cops for the first time. And I was, I mostly had a view of police deeply informed by the media at that time. I had only the most fantastical romantic sense of what cops did, but when I met them, they were just pretty mundane. They were pretty average. They looked a certain way. They were overwhelmingly white and they were all men, a lot of bald heads and big biceps, but they were otherwise like relatively normal people who talked about normal things like overtime and days off. And that stuck with me until Michael Brown was killed in 2014 in Ferguson. And that's when I began to see, as a grad student, I began trying to read, which is what grad students do a lot of, is reading.
Right.
And I was kind of finding out alongside people that we didn't seem to know all that much about the police empirically. This was before websites like The Counted and other nonprofits and journalistic groups put together data sets on people shot by the police. But in 2014, I was seeing headlines like, we don't even know how many people are shot by the police. And that didn't sit well with me. I started looking for even basic information about things like, how many police are there? And it turns out our census of the police in the US was like already a decade old at the time, which struck me as a real problem. And so I grew less and less convinced that I was going to be able to answer my growing questions about the how and the why of policing through something like a survey. And so I decided to take it back to the 1970s when these first studies were done and like get into a car. And so that is a mixture of sort of where I came from and what I was interested in, intersecting with what I was developing as sort of a scholarly interest while I was in graduate school.
So you brought up something. Your original focus was in gangs. And I'm not going to put you on the spot, but I've said that police is kind of another institution of a gang, just looked at differently. Were there some commonalities that you found between the ethos of gangs and policing as far as that communal, I don't know, kind of camaraderie that's in gangs that might also be in policing, that's sticking by one another and standing up for one another no matter what?
So I take your question and it resonates. Like, I don't want to take the metaphor too far.
Okay.
And it's for a couple of reasons. So at the most shallow level, the simple level, some things ring very similar. Let's start super simple. Mostly male. Very similar between street gangs and cops.
Right.
Colors. Very, very similar. There's a clear in-group and a clear out-group. That's very similar. The use of violence as a means for solving problems. Very similar. I think that it's important to underscore that as serious a problem as things like gang violence are, and communities that struggle with this problem would be the first to tell you this is a serious problem. It's important not to lose sight of the fact that the police are special because they are the state. And so I think that gangs are a serious problem, and there are some commonalities. I think the difference is that when gangs use violence, that is essentially roundly illegal.
Right.
Our analysis of what we do about the problem of police violence has to account for the fact that the vast majority of the violence that they use is legal. We've defined it as such. It's within policy. Now, legal and moral are two very different things, and legal and just are two very different things. But the metaphor, I think, begins to break down when you begin to see how big the apparatus around policing is that supports them, not just in terms of billions of dollars, but the legal protections they have, the public support that the police enjoy that gangs do not. That's where I think we have to begin to draw that clear distinction. But as far as things like in-group and out-group, and we call it cohesion, within groups, there's a very strong sense of cohesion within policing as well.
Okay, so you start this research, and how do you go about trying to find the answers to the questions that you initially had and that are continuously growing as you're doing the research from this outdated data that you have to go all the way back to the 70s? And I'm going to assume, because you're younger than I am, that your research was in the mid 2000s, like before 2010 or around that time?
No, the book was based on work that is from 2014 to 2018. So again, I was interested starting with the killing of Michael Brown. And so, so I essentially got in a car. 2014,
right. Okay, yeah, correct. So you got this outdated data that's going back 40 years, 45 years? 1970. How did you get the answers to your questions? And what new questions developed as you were continuing to do research?
Yeah. So an important distinction when I say data is that there's all different kinds of data. And so I think we often think of quantitative stuff, surveys and numbers and figures and line graphs. And we've had that data, and some of that is quite old. When I say, like, kicking it back to the 70s, that's when these original policing scholars got into a car. And that's data too. It's qualitative data, observations and interviews, and just observing the world around you to understand how other people understand the world and make sense of it. And so I wanted to use that tried and true method of being there, of seeing what other people see to understand versus having them report to me,
Right.
oh, like, what is your life like based on the survey question that I made up with 5 responses. I want to be there and talk to you on the street with you. And it's, I think this is actually a story about research generally, is that no one is really uncovering brand new things. I think part of what I uncovered or what I show is that policing has been shockingly consistent over the past half century. And so scholars from the 1950s were talking about how important danger is in the minds of police officers. So in the Danger Imperative, the book that I wrote from data on 2014 to 18, that's still actually really consistent. This idea that officers are deeply preoccupied with violence and danger. The wrinkle is that while in the 1970s, that was actually the peak of what we know about officer mortality, killed in the line of duty, policing has been growing safer over the past half century. And yet the rhetoric is very consistent. And that is the sort of intervention that I was interested in really honing in on. How is it that despite empirical, observable, statistical increases in officer safety and wellness, a decrease in mortality, they're still talking about their job as if it's more dangerous than ever? Why is the war on cops this thing that we're talking about right now, despite changes that would suggest your job is growing safer over time? And oddly enough, that wasn't the conversation that I was interested in first having when I got in the car. At first, I wanted to talk about community policing, which was something I'd been thinking about and reading about at the time. It was, in the air after Michael Brown was killed. Community policing is going to save the world. And all I got was boilerplate responses. All I got was, community. We're a community policing department. It's all about relationships. And I just wasn't seeing it. They were mostly just taking calls. I wasn't seeing a lot of community policing.
What can you, for my audience, and I guess
for sure.
for me, can you give kind of a clear definition of how community policing would be a different strategy than what they typically do?
Sure. So if I were to ask 100 police officers what is community policing, I'm going to get 200 different responses.
Okay.
So in theory, community policing is not a definable strategy, which is part of the problem. It's more of like a general philosophy or an ethos, which is that we need to co-produce public safety with the public. And as part of that, you want to engage as an officer in positive non-enforcement interactions with the public to get a sense of what matters to them, what problems they think exist in their community, and then use that as a launching point for creating strategies to solve the problems that the community has itself pointed out to you as being things that they care about. And the community can get involved not only in the defining the problem part, but also sometimes in the actual problem solving itself. Okay. The issue is that community policing, it has become essentially anything that you want to call community policing: coffee with a cop, ice cream cones with an officer, police athletically, community meetings, door knock. Like, it is everything and nothing, which is why I think when I asked officers originally, what is community policing? They were like, I don't know. It's this thing that we do, and relationships and trust and which was a very different conversation than when I began to ask them about this term they kept using, which was officer safety. They kept saying officer safety, officer safety, officer safety. If I asked them why they stopped a car here and not there, officer safety. Why don't you wear your seatbelt? Officer safety. Why did you pull them out of the car? Officer safety, officer safety, officer safety. And that was sort of the light bulb moment of, I think I might be concentrating on the wrong thing. I should probably concentrate on the thing that they are talking about constantly, which is officer safety.
So is officer safety a definable thing, or is it subjective depending on the particular officer, what they deem as safe for them?
Sure. So in some ways, it's very consistent. Officer safety is a largely unassailable, unquestionable thing that matters. And it can be boiled down very simply, right? It's something, officer safety is me taking steps to make sure that I am not injured or killed. Simple. How individual officers go about ensuring officer safety is where you see more movement, right? There's a spectrum there in how you're going to go about doing that. But the underlying assumption that officer safety, officer survival is key for me every day while I'm on patrol as an officer, that is not something that varies markedly between officers, at least not based on the information and the data that I've gathered.
Okay, so you've done ride-alongs and you've like boots on the ground You didn't do the survey questions, and you said boots on the ground. I want to see and experience what it is that you're seeing and experiencing.
Mhm.
And you're saying you kept hearing officer safety, and there was an overwhelming theme of danger. Is danger fear,
Mm.
or is it just, hey, everything around us and everything that we do is dangerous? Because I'm not knocking cops at all. I think it is an important job. We need cops. It is a dangerous job. But I had a friend who was a firefighter,
Mm.
and I said, I think your job is more dangerous than a cop. And they said, no
Mm.
way, a cop's job is more dangerous. And I said, well, actually, like you're going in to fight a fire. Are there some calls where there's not a fire? Of course. But when you're going in to fight a fire, fires are, you don't, they're unpredictable as people
Mm.
are, but fires are absolutely unpredictable. And you don't have a measure really truly to truly fight a fire when it's unpredictable, as in cops have guns. So if
Mm.
somebody else pulls a gun on you,
Mm.
a cop, a cop has kind of an equalizer.
Mm.
So is it fear in that danger, or is it just, hey, our job is dangerous, this is what we have to do?
That's an interesting question. So, using the firefighter example as a jumping off point, I think
Mhm,
one of the obvious distinctions between how police talk about the danger of their work and how firefighters talk about the danger of their work is that fire doesn't have agency, right? Fire has no free will. Fire is a physical phenomenon.
mhm,
And in that sense, fire, I know you're saying fire is unpredictable, and that's true to some extent, but there's actually like a science around firefighting. We know there are certain techniques for fighting certain kinds of fires. You don't address a chemical fire the same way you address like a house fire. There are clear steps and procedures. And importantly, you're not worried that the fire hates you.
okay,
Police often talk
yes,
about a public that hates them, that
mhm,
wants to hurt them, that wants to see them dead. And I think from your firefighter friend's perspective, that's likely coloring how they think about which job is more dangerous.
mm,
There is something very emotional about the idea of somebody, a person, choosing to harm you in a given moment. And we can talk about why they're choosing to harm you. But for an officer, the why is pretty irrelevant if someone pulls a gun on them or
right,
somebody tries to punch them or stab them. And so, from that perspective, I think that it's a useful comparison, but that's a big difference is the agency of the fire. Now, fear versus danger, I've never met an officer who said, I am afraid. And I think it would be unlikely for them to say as much. I've had officers tell me some cops walk around scared, but no one's admitted to it. And I think for any officers that happen to listen or any officers that hear this, they will use words like, I'm not scared, I'm prepared. I'm not scared, I'm aware. Now, that might just be because an outside researcher is asking and no one likes to admit that they're scared.
mhm,
But they don't view it as fear, at least not in the interactions that I had. They view it as, well, we see the worst of the worst. We see a world that most people never see, and that's very true. People don't really have a sense of just how much awful shit the police see. I'm sorry, am
mhm.
I allowed to curse?
Yeah,
Just
a little bit. That's okay.
okay,
That's okay.
okay,
All the
uh,
episodes are explicit, so
okay.
that's
Um,
why I label them as. So you're okay.
um, and so that much is very true. Police see awful things all the time.
Mhm,
Um, and so where vigilance turns into fear, it's hard for me to draw that line. I think it's certainly the case that there are some officers that walk around scared. But I don't think that you necessarily have to assume they're afraid
mhm.
to see the kinds of outcomes that I talk about in the book.
Well, let's talk about your book. The very first question: why
Sure.
is it important for our audience, the listeners, the watchers, to read your book?
I think that people should read The Danger Imperative because it's entirely likely that how you think about the police is not based on fact.
Hmm.
I think that we all get views of what policing is through movies and through television shows and even the coverage in the media. You only see the most overt errors made by the police. You don't see the day to day interactions. You don't see the day-to-day violence, which is not shootings. It's grabbing people, it's pushing people, it's handcuffing people. And I think that the conversations that we have around policing tend to focus on the most extreme outcomes.
Mm-hmm.
If you want to understand how the day-to-day reality of policing is part and parcel of those extreme outcomes, this is a book that helps you understand that. This is not a story of bad apples. This is not a story of especially immoral or incompetent officers. This is a story about systems. And I think that that is a crucial piece that a lot of the conversation around policing, even from folks that read the newspaper and are informed, they don't see the system. And this book shows you the system from the day that officers walk into the academy to the day that they retire, how danger and violence is emphasized at every level of the policing institution and what that means for police behavior.
Ooh, okay. I don't want to give too much of the book away because I want my listeners to go and buy the book and read the book. But
Okay.
I'm very interested when you say systems.
Mm.
Without giving too much away, because like I said, we want people to go and buy and read your book. How do systems imprint danger into an individual's mind, which you would think that they would become a police officer for this noble desire to better their community? And not to say that that ever changes, but there's an idea, like you said, of what we have of cops and policing. And then there's this kind of, if you grew up in the 80s like I did, cop shows, Law and Order is still out there, SVU is still out there. And these movies, cops were these things that you actually wanted to aspire to be.
Mm-hmm.
How you go from that to, my job is really dangerous, right? Maybe I didn't realize how dangerous this job actually was. And the system, as you say, kind of almost feeding that feeling.
Mm-hmm. For sure. Yeah, I think that a lot of officers do join with the best of intentions. They want to contribute to their communities. They believe in the need of providing safety. They believe that there are some people that are victims of crime and violence, and they want to protect people. And I think that's a very real thing. I'm not discounting that as a motivation for joining the police department at all.
Mm-hmm.
But it turns out that when you join the police academy, you are shown a different version. Now, to be clear, TV and movies emphasize the danger of policing all the time, right? Like how many gun battles have you seen in a police movie or a police show? And so I think that is actually in line with a lot of what the academy is showing. It's just a little bit more graphic and it hits a little bit closer to home. And so one example from the book that I talk about is the most famous YouTube video that non-police have never heard of. And it's a YouTube video which details the gruesome murder of Deputy Kyle Dinkkeller in Georgia almost 30 years ago. In short, the video is used within police academies to underscore for new recruits just how dangerous their job is and the cost if they are unwilling or unable to use violence in defense of their own lives. And now I've talked about this video and I write about it in great detail in the book, and even just the description is pretty graphic. There's a reason I don't show the video and any talks that I give. Anyone that YouTubes it, please, like, huge content warning. It's incredibly graphic. But its graphic nature is precisely why it's used in police training. You hear an officer take their last breaths. You hear them screaming in terror as this driver shoots at them, hits them multiple times, comes around the side of the car, executes the officer. That is just one example that is used in police academies across the country to emphasize for officers just how dangerous their job is and how necessary it is for them to not think about their job in purely romantic terms of justice and honor and courage. And instead, like, your job is about survival. And all this other stuff, serving the community, all this other stuff around community policing and procedural justice, like, none of that matters when it comes to the moment of truth. And you need to understand that your job is about survival.
I was literally getting ready before you pointed out to that. You said that movies and television shows do point out the violence of a police officer, but I would also say it kind of romanticizes it. And this video is a shell shock saying, no, this is what you're signing up for. This is the real. Isn't that a good thing? Isn't it a good thing to let these new recruits know, hey, what you saw in the TVs and movies, this romanticism of the violence of being a cop or detective or is okay. There's that. Here's the real. Isn't that a good thing to kind of shock these people out of that romanticized idea of what policing is?
So the word real is really important here. So it is certainly true. Deputy Dinkheller was murdered on the side of that road, and other officers have been murdered and will continue to be murdered in various contexts in the course of their work. What we're talking about, though, is how much emphasis you put on that. And so if this is a video that is sometimes shown on the first or second day of the academy, and it is continually referenced, and other videos of this are shown. And so one thing that I talk about in the book is that it's not that these things don't happen. It's that the perceived probability of these catastrophic things happening is amplified again and again and again and again. So even if I restrict the number of videos that I show to, let's call it 10 videos of an officer being murdered in a traffic stop or at a domestic violence call, I have now shown you probably 9 to 10 more examples of an officer being killed than will happen in your entire career. So there is something in your department, to be clear, not across the entire country.
Right.
So it is important to show officers that this is something that happens. I think that where we begin to go into dangerous territory, no pun intended, is when we teach officers that this is something that needs to be in the back of your mind during all interactions, because no interaction is safe and anybody might choose to harm you at any moment. I think that that is something that is not really considered all that often in the context of police training and policy, is that what are the unintended consequences of emphasizing for recruits and for officers once they've graduated that any call might be their last.
Doesn't stop there. Liquid IV believes that access to clean and abundant water is the foundation of a healthier world. That's why they partner with leading organizations, finding innovative solutions to help those unsolicited perspectives. So, Dr. Michael, we've talked about the videos that are shown throughout training to kind of imprint how serious and dangerous the job of being a police officer is. Would you say there's a sense of dread of danger, and what other tools besides videos does a system use to imprint this is a dangerous job?
For sure. Similar to the conversation around fear, right? Where vigilance becomes dread, I think is an open question. But I do think that if we think about dread as something like a very emotionally laden expectation, then I 100% think it's dread. And so what I describe in the book, what the danger imperative is a lens that officers wear that is centered on the preoccupation with violence and the provision of officer safety. That is what the danger imperative is. And it's constructed, it's something that's recreated very intentionally within policing. It's not accidental. And it's not something that is simply downloaded by police in the academy and then they use it when they go out. Instead, it begins in the academy and progresses through their entirety of the time that officers spend in the police department. So as far as other examples, number one, they will continue to show videos like the Dinkheller shooting in lineup. These are called lineup training videos, but you can go to YouTube right now, and there's now, because of the advent of social media and the internet, there's an endless supply of videos of officers getting in fights or getting shot at or traffic stops gone bad. This is very different from 30 years ago when departments would trade VHS tapes, right? Or you'd only have the dash cams from your own department. Now there's a bottomless pool of examples that you can show in your department to your officers. So that reinforcement continues to happen. Another example that happens at lineup, which is when officers get together before they go out on patrol to be counted, like I'm here, here's your assignment, etc. In one department that I was in, they're called hot sheets. They used to be on paper, now they're all via email. But it's just a list of all the violent crime that has happened in the city over the past shift or so. Now, importantly, these are all violent crimes. They're aggravated assaults, they're robberies, they're homicides. But there's an important little beginning of each one of those incidents on a hot sheet, and it's OFCR SFTY or something similar. It's for officer safety. That's why you're being told about every single one of these incidents. Now, ostensibly, you can use these descriptions of the victim and the suspect to find somebody and arrest them for the crime that was committed. That's the ideal scenario.
Mm-hmm.
I've never seen that happen in practice. Never did I see somebody actually use one of these hot sheets as a means to stop somebody or arrest somebody. The likelihood is perishingly low, but that's going to be what leads to somebody being arrested.
Okay.
What it does show every shift is that violence is real. The violence is out there. And if you for a second think that violence is exaggerated, look at all these cases of violence that I can show you. There's new ones every single shift that I can show you about how real violence is. And it's for officer safety. You need to be concerned about this. Those are the more direct ones. There's another example that comes to mind, also from West River, which is my department on the West Coast. It's called an officer safety bulletin. Now, traditionally, officer safety bulletins were restricted to your own department, as in you would provide a bulletin to officers about, hey, we have reason to suspect that there is a particular group that has made threats against officers. Be on the lookout. Very common sort of thing to see in a bulletin. Because of a wide and growing intelligence network in the US, something that I call the threat network, you're actually crowdsourcing incidents of threat from across the country. And so one example that I saw in West River was a printout. The initial bulletin came from the Baltimore Police Department, and it showed a picture of a super soaker water gun that had been hollowed out and somebody had hidden a shotgun inside.
Wow.
And so that was the bulletin, was like, you need to be on the lookout because people, or there is the possibility that water guns now have guns hidden inside. So be aware of this. But once you look a little bit closer at the bulletin, the story gets a little bit muddier. So first of all, the bulletin was from like 2005. So 9 years before I observed this in 2014-15.
Okay.
The initial water gun was found by one department in Florida, not Baltimore.
Okay.
And it turns out that the seizure of that weapon, of the weapon inside the water gun, was put into an original bulletin by another police department in Florida. And so it's this weird sort of threat telephone that happens where if you can find an example of threat in one place at one time, this gets disseminated to departments potentially across the entire country. And what that does in practice is emphasize to officers that a threat to police anywhere is a threat to police everywhere. Whether or not there's any reason to suspect that this is happening on the West Coast is besides the point. An officer someplace found this, which means that we have to be ready for it here as well.
Now, in your book, you talk about police culture. How do these bulletins, the danger, the videos of danger, the dread of danger, how does that affect police culture?
The way I describe it in the book is that these examples are both a product and a cause of culture. So there's a perpetual question about, well, what came first, the structure or culture? Is culture something that emerges or something that exists outside of our institutions like schools or police departments or hospitals? And what I try to argue in the book is that it's not to say that police are the only people that care about danger or threat. I think that's very obvious. Mm-hmm. But imagine if at your job, well, let's take my job as a professor. Daily bulletins about the threat of violence don't make a lot of sense in my world. Why? Well, because it doesn't fit into the other parts of the structure in which I exist. Okay. I didn't go through a socialization process where I was told about how dangerous my job was. I'm actually not expected to do anything about violence. I'm certainly not expected to arrest people in my job. So these bulletins don't make a whole lot of sense in the context that I live in, within my cultural context as a professor. But it turns out within policing, the values, the assumptions, the emphasis on violence means that something like a officer safety bulletin or hot sheets or these videos, they make perfect sense. And once you begin to use these mechanisms to reinforce the values and assumptions of that institutional space, like the preoccupation with violence, the necessity of ensuring officer safety, the possibility that the public may try and hurt you at any moment, you actually begin to recreate the very culture that you're basing those things off in the first place. And it becomes a self-perpetuating phenomenon. You can think of it as almost a cultural inertia. And so it's difficult to say for sure, was it the bulletins that made the culture, or was it the culture that made the bulletins? I think it's more useful to think about what are the things that are sort of speaking to each other, what's in dialect, what's causing this self-perpetuating phenomenon of the danger imperative, in part because I only observed police in 2014 to 2018. And my informed suspicion is that you saw this emphasis on officer safety and survival likely kick off in the 1970s when we saw police deaths. We saw their peaks in the 1970s. We saw the beginning of sort of what you might think of as modern gun culture in the 1970s. This is part of another project that I'm beginning to work on, but I can't speak to it conclusively. But I do believe this culture existed for a long time. And what I'm looking at right now is how does it continue to exist today?
So you said it all started from Michael Brown. What did your research tell you about interaction with the police with other ethnicities, cultures, genders, if there was a difference in the way they would interact with other genders?
So when I began the work in 2014, I think that my prior was that I would see really clear evidence of overt racial animus in my ride-alongs with police. And to be very frank, I didn't see it. I didn't see examples of racial epithets. I didn't see examples of overt brutality, for example, which I've been asked about. Like, well, tell me about the times that you saw officers, be brutal. And I didn't see what I think. I didn't see a beating like you would see captured on for YouTube or something like that. Those things happen, but I didn't see them. And I think that they are, in the grand scheme of police interaction, rare. What I think I did begin to see was that the system that I talk about in the book is one in which, even if I were to make the assumption that officers are perfectly egalitarian, they don't see race, they're perfectly not racist. Let's imagine we have a perfect filtering mechanism.
Okay.
And we don't have any racist cops. Nothing else has changed in the system. Segregation still exists. Broken schools still exist. The rest of structural racism continues to operate as it always has. And I'm going to be sending officers, because of where crime and violence are, again, because these things are social, they're something that's generated by poverty and disinvestment. I'm going to keep sending cops to the same places, and they're going to be preoccupied with their safety in the same places. And so it makes perfect sense that I would see inequalities in police violence concentrating in the same places over time. Now, to be clear, I think the assumption of perfectly egalitarian officers is a very strong assumption. We have mountains of evidence to suggest that officers are not perfectly egalitarian and that racial bias and overt racism are real and exist in police departments today. What I want to highlight for listeners and for readers is that if you think this is a story of especially racist cops, you're missing the boat here. This is a story of a system that in many cases protects those officers, but it doesn't depend on those officers. I could be a perfectly well-meaning person and put them in a police department, and they are going to do things in the name of officer safety that at the aggregate, in the macro level, look like inequalities in police violence that break down along race and that break down along gender. And I think an important point as well for listeners is that I saw officers use violence against Black people, against white people, against Latino people. My particular method of observing directly is not really good for making claims about percentage of officers did this versus that, because again, I don't have a random sample. It's not designed to make that kind of claim. But this is something that affects all people. We have other data which shows that it disproportionately affects Black people and Latino people and men. But I've seen a Black officer be incredibly disrespectful and aggressive towards a white woman. Like, this is not like white women are not utterly insulated from this. This is a problem about the system. But to be clear, someone that looks like you or looks like me, if I was a betting man, we have a higher likelihood of being treated disrespectfully and treated aggressively than my wife or a white woman who is in her home, which is the example that I observed and talk about in the book.
Can part of that be attributed to the fact that in a way police officers have a lot of power, And can't that affect even the most secure and angelic person's ego? Just the fact that you have this power. You said there at the beginning that everything, our laws are kind of set up to protect police officers and protect their safety. Wouldn't that lead to not necessarily an ego trip, but a kind of puff your chest out power trip when
Hmm.
dealing with people?
So the word that comes to mind, which I describe in the book, or the phrase, the concept, is called command presence. And so this is something that's explicitly taught to officers. And it's emphasized not only in the academy, but in their field training, which is a period right when you become a sworn police officer. You usually have, it depends on the department, but you have several months of like on the job training with a field training officer, essentially like watching you, and you go from just watching to them just watching you do the work and only jumping in if you need help. But command presence is key the whole way through. And the idea of command presence, I've sort of described it as something like a demeanor which exudes competence, confidence, and authority. And I've seen officers use command presence to great effect, right? This might not be popular with some of my more liberal colleagues, but like there is a time and a place for people to raise their voices. There is a time and a place for someone to say, hey, I'm talking now. You there, you come with me. You know, there is a time and a place, and I've seen officers do this to great effect. The problem is that not all officers do it to great effect. And to be very blunt, some officers are just assholes. And this gets framed as command presence, because command presence is necessary to ensure control. And within the context of the danger imperative, control, or what prior scholarship is called maintaining the edge, is absolutely necessary. Because if you lose control of the interaction, you have opened the door for catastrophe. You have introduced the possibility that this person is going to go from just being rude and being disrespectful and verbally resisting. You are allowing the possibility of this escalating to potentially lethal violence. And so command presence is a manifestation of police authority and power, which officers are taught is absolutely necessary to prevent things from escalating. I think when rubber meets road and we get out into the real world, some officers use command presence in that imperative to maintain control as an excuse for being assholes.
Okay. What were some of the during your research? What were some of the key things that you saw that either sparked interest in you in a positive or a negative way? Just instances while you were just riding along, or when you were in police stations, were there certain things that you saw or observed, and you were just like, "Huh, that's interesting," or "Wow, I didn't see that coming."
Sure. Yeah. So one example comes to mind. It's from chapter 4, which is the chapter is called Going Home at Night. And it's all about the behavioral effects of the danger imperative. What do officers actually do as a result of seeing the world in a particular way that's focused on violence? And so I was on the West Coast again, but I'd actually seen the behavior on the East Coast. And the behavior was an officer touching the trunk of the car. Sometimes the taillight, sometimes it's the lid of the trunk during a traffic stop. So on their way to the driver's side window, if they're doing a driver's side approach, or the passenger side for a passenger side approach, they'll touch the trunk. And I made note of it on the East Coast, but then I saw it happen again on the West Coast. And I was like, okay, so this is not just like a department thing. This is something broader. And so I asked the officer that I was with, I think Officer Menendez was his name. And I asked him, hey, so like, I noticed that you touched the trunk of the car. I've seen this before, but I'm curious, like, why do you do it? And he said, oh, well, it's to make sure the trunk is closed. I said, okay, well, why does that matter? He said, well, you're checking to make sure the trunk is closed because you want to make sure there's not a gunman hiding in the trunk who's waiting to jump out and attack you. And I was like, okay, have you ever heard of that actually happening? And he said, well, no. I said, okay. And so we had some good rapport at this point. He was a young Mexican-American guy. He'd only been on for like a year at that time. And we're basically the same age. And so we're like, we're chopping it up. We're friendly. And I said, okay, well, like you can admit that the probability of there being a gunman in the trunk is exceedingly low. And his response was telling. He said, Sure, it's low, but that's how we're trained. Like, we don't train to stop granny. We train to expect like the worst possible outcome. It doesn't happen often, but people do fight you. And I was like, well, like, yeah, in sort of like a mathematical sense, he's not wrong. There's always a non-zero probability that there could be a gunman hiding in the trunk. So, you know what? If it makes you feel better, and this simple thing of checking the trunk closed there's no real cost to it, right?
Mhm.
Just touching the trunk. You're not being rude to anybody. You're not handcuffing anybody. You're not drawing your gun. You're just touching the trunk of the car. It's like, okay, like this seems like a relatively low cost thing that you could do to enhance your safety. I like, okay. And this stands out in contrast to what I consider to be very high cost things. In fact, so high cost that they actually can get officers killed. And that example is wearing seatbelts. Like I mentioned that earlier in our conversation, officers very frequently don't wear their seatbelts despite engaging in very dangerous driving. And the logic is that it's for their safety, which might not make a lot of sense.
It doesn't. Maybe you can explain it to me where it does make sense, because
Sure.
it does not make any sense to me.
Sure. And so this is, I think, it's both one of the most mundane examples, but one of the most, I think, illuminating examples about how the danger imperative works as a filter.
Mm-hmm.
And so remember, the danger imperative is a lens. It's sort of, think of it as violence tinted glasses that you can put on, and it highlights particular threats. By definition, it means that it doesn't highlight other things. And so when I asked officers, multiple officers, like, why don't you wear your seatbelt? It's even required in policy, like you're trained in the academy to wear your seatbelt like you're supposed to. They'll say, well, the seatbelt would prevent me from getting to my firearm if I needed it to address a threat. The seatbelt might get hung up on my equipment because they often, particularly if you have an external vest, you'll have your body cam, additional magazines, OC spray, radio, like all kinds of stuff on your chest. And they think, well, it might get cut up on my gear as I'm trying to get out of the car quickly to chase a suspect or to address a threat or to lend aid to an officer or something. And so as a result, they choose to not wear their seatbelt. Now, that all makes sense in the context of the danger imperative, where you're emphasizing the threat of violence,
right,
and systematically muting the much more likely threat of plowing into a light pole or a school bus or another police officer. And so these two examples are sort of on opposite ends of the, call it the cost spectrum. Touching the trunk of the car is not particularly costly.
right.
Not wearing your seatbelt is deeply ironic and dangerous in that not only is it not probabilistically likely, but you're actually, in the name of safety, engaging in a behavior that is drastically increasing the likelihood that you get injured or killed on patrol. It's just not by somebody with a gun.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so what is your idea for, I don't know if it's improving or just having a different tactic for policing and policing policies and training police?
So I'll start in two parts. One is
Okay.
what I think of as sort of the low-hanging policy fruit. And so I am a firm believer that we're not going to train our way out of this problem. I'm increasingly skeptical of calls for yet one more training, whether it be procedural justice training or cultural sensitivity training. The evidence that those things change police behavior in big ways essentially doesn't exist. If there are effects, they're relatively small. But if you were reform-minded and you wanted something that you could do today, I think that you change what kind of training you allow in departments. And so one thing I talk about in chapter 1, Survival School, is about someone named Lieutenant Colonel Dave Grossman. Lieutenant Colonel Dave Grossman is a former West Point professor turned celebrity police military trainer. And he is the self-professed founder of the field of killology. He's written several best-selling books, including On Killing and On Combat. And he's transitioned from teaching essentially just soldiers about what he calls sort of the psychology of violence to also training police departments.
Okay.
So some departments bring him in to train people. I think that they should stop doing that. But even if they don't bring him in directly, they often, as I saw in my Southwestern site, in Sunshine, they have his teachings in the official curricula. The official training documents say things like, you must become the predator to catch the predator or survive the predator.
Wow.
Again, the low-hanging fruit is just stop doing that. just
Yeah.
don't make things worse. Similarly, I think we should stop using taxpayer dollars to send officers to these third-party trainings, which are usually something that's required for departments to do because they don't have the manpower to do all their training in-house. And so they start letting officers go to private training companies to fulfill their state-mandated training hours for the year. I think that you should stop funding that with your tax dollars and my tax dollars. I think that state post, which is the police officer standards and training or peace officer standards and training boards or commissions, whatever it's called in the state, they should also do a top to bottom audit of who they've approved to give training. Currently, the oversight is relatively minimal. Once you get approved to be a trainer, there's like no oversight of what you actually tell officers in these trainings. And I think that's a problem. And it's this Wild West scenario where if you get this golden ticket of being an approved trainer and the bar is not particularly high to be an approved trainer, you can kind of teach whatever you want and it's for profit and all of it is paid for with your dollars and my dollars. So that's the policy end.
Okay. I have a quick question.
Yeah,
we're,
please.
we're both talking about public servants in a way, teachers and police officers. I know because I studied secondary education in college and went into the classroom that the oversight for teachers is extraordinary. Why wouldn't there be a similar situation for the oversight for the people that are teaching or training the police officers? I don't understand why that wouldn't be the case. Fact of the matter is, I'm just now for the first time finding out a lot of what you're saying as far as the training and the privatizing of the training of the police department. I had no idea that any of this even existed. I had no idea that my tax dollars are going towards police officers being trained by private companies. I had no idea about this. So why is there not an oversight for the training, the teaching of people that are supposed to be defending and policing our communities as there would be for teachers for every single thing that they teach?
I think it's an incisive question, particularly in the current political moment in which we're at, where we're, without going too far down this train of conversation, we're pulling books off shelves, we're undermining public education, we want to privatize it. I think that the scrutiny of schools is shocking considering the lack of, not public scrutiny, because we have news stories and we have other things to look at police departments. But you would think that we should have access to the data they produce. Even that seems to be a high bar for us, right? Like Austin just opened its like revamped data portal and it doesn't offer a ton of stuff in it. Some departments are further along than others, but ask anybody who's tried to get information from a police department how easy it is to get body cam footage or arrest records or any of that stuff. It's usually battled by FOIA, which they can resist in various ways. So why? I think the why is a much bigger story about politics and history. I think that politicians in particular are very well aware of the political power that's wielded by not only things like a police union, but by political interests that align themselves with the sort of, call it like a law and order value system, and that any critique of police is viewed as something that is un-American. It is a threat to democracy. It's a threat to safety. And when you get down to brass tacks, I think that the budget items for a police department are always going to go towards overtime and cars and officers, and training is one of the first things that gets cut. And so when that happens and you cut training, even just training academy instructors, which like just the bodies to teach the stuff, it ends up getting outsourced, and it gets outsourced to private companies.
Okay, so that was the policy.
That's the policy.
That's the policy. So the other part to that question is, what are some of the practices that can be changed outside of policy?
Outside of policy.
Yeah.
And so I might have spoken out of turn. So there is policy. It's just not going to be operating within policing. And I think that's a key distinction. So one is like, what can a department, a chief, for example, do today? So notice I'm not talking about federal change, in part because the federal government can't make local police departments do stuff. It can incentivize it with funding and that kind of stuff, but it can't make them do stuff. Which is why a chief, I think, has to be the person who decides, or a city council makes it a priority at the local level. we are going to do the following with our training curricula, or the chief says we are no longer funding these trainers or this kind of training until we've audited it, you could do that locally. And I think that's where the action is going to be, local and state. But at a much bigger level, a much higher level, I think that we need to change our conversation around officer safety and public safety as being somehow two different things. We often discuss those as two separate problems. Officer safety is something that officers deal with because they get guns and vests. And you know what? Like, you need to ensure your safety on the street. And we also have all kinds of laws and policies that are sort of in the background that give them the powers to essentially use violence to protect themselves. But that's talked about somehow as separate from the strategies and the goal of ensuring public safety. And I think that we need to stop talking about these two things as separate, because I think that we're actually in a position where we could enhance public safety, as in reduce crime and reduce violence, in a way that is twofold. One, actually enhances safety for officers too, and two, doesn't require major investment or major structural change on the part of police. What am I referring to? Turns out we actually know about a bunch of things that can do things like reduce crime and violence that don't require you to send somebody with a badge and a gun. You can reduce crime and violence by doing things as simple as improving lighting in an area. You can reduce crime and violence by fixing the broken down facades of abandoned buildings and greening these vacant lots. Philadelphia recently tried this and saw reductions in crime and violence. There's evidence which suggests that if you plant more trees in urban areas, that you can reduce crime and violence, because it turns out that ambient temperature is related to crime and violence. A recent study from a group of economists also found that if you were to increase the number of behavioral health treatment centers at the county level, you can reduce the number of assaults specifically against police officers. And so it turns out there's a whole bunch of things that we could be trying that reduce crime and violence that directly affects the public, and by extension, reduces crime and violence on the same streets that police officers spend their time on. I think police should be the first ones supporting these kinds of endeavors, in part because it means less work for them. But it turns out that unions and departments very often oppose anything that would reduce the dominance of police in the conversation around public safety. And I think that's an economic story. I think that's unions and departments looking out for their budget lines, looking out for those line items. They know that if other people are working on crime and violence, that, well, maybe we don't need as big of a police budget. And that means less overtime, and that means less officers. And so I would like to see a world where officers and departments and large organizations like the International Association of Chiefs of Police, the Fraternal Order of Police, Police Benevolence Association, all these big orgs increasingly call for non-police things like lighting and facades and trees and public health that actually can keep their officers safe too, and can reduce crime and can reduce violence.
So basically improving local infrastructure and giving people that live in these communities with burned out buildings and abandoned buildings and these empty lots a little bit of sunshine and hope. And then that, in effect, can reduce violence and crime. Is that a really simplistic way of saying what you said? Is that if you give people a little bit of hope,
sure,
then most of the time people turn to crime or violence because they have no hope. Not to say that there aren't people who are just violent, because there are, but a lot of people turn to crime and violence because they got no other options.
Yeah, I think it's a key point, right? I think that there are some people that, if you want to think of it as a spectrum and being violence prone, they're higher on that end of the spectrum. That much I think is true in the world of human variation. I think that that's right. But similar to police violence, I don't think that violence out in the world is a story of bad apples and bad people. It's a story of systems. Yeah. It's a story of poverty. It's a story of disinvestment. It's a story of broken schools and bad healthcare and food deserts and lead in the water. That's what drives macro patterns in violence. And so for something as simple as improving lighting and greening lots and facades, don't get me wrong, if I could, with a straight face, say the answer is fixing poverty and had a way to do that, I would say that. Right. But I don't, right? I don't have a magic fix inequality lever or a turn back the clock on structural racism and redlining and segregation lever. I don't have it. But what I think you are pointing to is that there are relatively simple turns out very inexpensive options for reducing crime and violence. And I think that fundamentally, this is something that some of my colleagues have written about, right? Like, violence is real and we're trying to stop the bleeding. And there's a variety of ways to do that. It's just that for a very long time, we have treated police as the only and best option to do that. And I don't think that that's accurate. And I think that there are a lot of unintended consequences, both in terms of financial and human costs, to relying on the police so single-mindedly to solve not just violence and crime, but social problems writ large. Because we send police to do a whole bunch of stuff. Mental illness and arguments between their mom and their kid that doesn't want to go to school today, and arguments between neighbors. And this person didn't give me a receipt, so I called the cops. Like, why are the police going to this? Like, why?
Right. Mm-hmm.
And officers themselves will tell you that, like, I don't know why I'm being sent to this. This is not a police matter. You want somebody arrested or somebody, like, what do you want here? And so I think, ironically enough, the things that I'm suggesting would accomplish getting things off the plate of police. But very often there is tremendous political resistance to doing something besides policing. And that's, I think, a deeper symptom of what's been written about as a culture of control that exists in the US. The idea that we solve problems through coercion, we solve problems through violence. And I think I and many others are increasingly calling for something besides cops and bars and guns and bullets and handcuffs to try and address problems. Mental health doesn't need handcuffs most of the time. Arguments don't need guns most of the time. Often you need social workers and healthcare. And those are things that we have disinvested in for decades. And I think we should turn back the clock on that if we can.
I think that was an excellent final point to conclude this interview. This has been, I've learned a lot during this interview. I know my audience will have learned a lot during this interview. Everybody, I implore everybody to go out there and get Dr. Michael's book, The Danger Imperative, Violence, Death, and Soul of Policing. Dr. Michael, is there anything else that you want to say to my audience out there before I let you go?
First, thank you for listening. For any that are interested, The Danger Imperative is available on Amazon, anywhere books are sold. Would love for you to get a copy, leave a review. Also, if you want to reach out to me directly, you can find me at www.dangerimperative.com. You can shoot me a message. You can find out more information about the book, including a sneak peek of some pictures from the field, which are not included in the book by and large. And you can also find me on Twitter. You can find me on Instagram at Michael Sierra. That's Sierra, and then just add one more A at the end of it, Michael Sierra A.
Thank you again, Dr. Michael, for coming on the show. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me. I really enjoyed it.
You know, I walked into this interview having a certain idea of police, and I know police officers. I have friends that are police officers. I have friends that are in policing, whether it be the FBI, the DEA, Secret Service. I have friends that are in these entities. But me being a Black man in America, I have a certain perception of what policing is, and me understanding the history of how policing got started. I can admit that I have some biases when it comes to police officers. I understand, believe it or not, as a young kid, I actually wanted to be a police officer. The idea of helping people and doing good has always been appealing to me. But I also know that I'm one of those type of people that would turn into a vigilante because I can't see good things happen to no bad things happen to good people, and sometimes they just don't get justice, you know. But speaking to Dr. Michael, it was eye-opening to hear how the brainwashing is not the right word. That's not the right word. But this idea of how they instill this sense of danger in their job, and they should, because it is a dangerous job. We're those people that are not in police, even those people that have family members that are police officers, I'm sure that a lot of times these police officers are not coming home and giving you the gory details of what they're seeing every day. and their life is on the line. I made that analogy that I've always felt like a firefighter's life was in more danger than a police officer. And speaking to Dr. Michael, I've learned that form of thinking was flawed. And this is the reason why I have people on the show and why we have these very tough conversations to get perspectives, unsolicited perspectives. These aren't unsolicited perspectives. These are perspectives because I'm asking for them. But to get these perspectives about things that we don't have full context on, and you can learn. And I understand I've always understood it's a really tough job, but Dr. Michael explained how much tougher it actually is. And I never even thought about it. And there is a romanticism from television and movies about cops and realizing that, ain't no dirty Harrys out here for real, for real. You know what I'm saying? Like that romanticism that you just got the magnum and you blown away bad guys. People can get intoxicated with that idea. And it's good that training police officers kind of gives you the shell shock of, that's not the way it is. But on the flip side, to bombard police officers constantly with this danger imperative that's coming can they won't admit fear, but it's got to be scary. And when you're scared, we tend to do things out of our nature because we're scared. So it was just it was a really, really interesting conversation. I'm really happy to have Dr. Michael on. Once again, you can get all his information in the description section on both the audio and the video platform. Also, you can go to unsolicitedperspectives.com and click on his profile, and it has links to all of his information. The website, go buy the book. The book is on Amazon. Go buy the book. There are links not only in the description section, but also on the website. Go buy his book. Go read more. He's somebody that's going to be back on the show because there's going to be something that happens. Unfortunately, there's going to be something that happens, and I'm going to want to get his perspective on it. But once again, thank you to Dr. Michael. Thank you all for listening, for watching. And until next time, as always, I'll holla. Whew, that was a hell of a show. Thank you for rocking with us here on Unsolicited Perspectives with Bruce Anthony. Now, before you go, don't forget to follow, subscribe, like, comment, and share our podcast wherever you're listening or watching it to it. Pass it along to your friends. If you enjoy it, that means the people that you rock will enjoy it also. So share the wealth, share the knowledge, share the noise. And for all those people that say, well, I don't have a YouTube. If you have a Gmail account, you have a YouTube. Subscribe to our YouTube channel where you can actually watch our video podcast. But the real party is on our Patreon page, After Hours Uncensored and Talking Straight-ish. After Hours Uncensored is another show with my sister. And once again, the key word there is uncensored. Those are exclusively on our Patreon page. Jump onto our website at unsolicitedperspective.com for all things us. That's where you can get all of our audio, video, our blogs, and even buy our merch. And if you're really feeling genuine and want to help us out, you can donate on our donations page. Donations go strictly to improving our software and hardware so we can keep giving you guys good content that you can clearly listen to and that you can clearly see. So any donation would be appreciative. Most importantly, I want to say thank you for listening and watching and supporting us. And I'll catch you next time. Audi 5000. Peace.